we are here to honor and celebrate the life of one of the most beloved and respected individuals in our field. I'm particularly delighted that we are joined by members of the Bloodstein family: Judith, Zoran, Danny, Phyllis, Corey, and Jan. When the idea of this event first arose, I contacted the family to discuss the possibility of a memorial at Brooklyn College. The sentiment was unanimous. What better place to hold this event? We knew that Oliver would have protested the idea of this memorial vehemently, but that eventually he would relent and possibly even approve of the idea in the end. While we are all saddened to have lost our mentor and friend, we are comforted by having the opportunity to share this time with one another. I want to thank Michael Bergen and Angela Caragliano for helping to organize this event and reaching out to a community of alumni and friends that spans over 60 years. Also, please note that when we conclude here today, we hope that you will come back and join us in 4400 Boylan for some refreshments and the opportunity to continue to share our stories and reflections. At this time, I would like to introduce the president of Brooklyn College, Karen Gould, who, while relatively new to this campus, has had an esteemed career in higher education and is well aware of the distinguished history of our discipline at the college and the legacy that Oliver has left to his family, friends, students, and colleagues. President Gould.
Thank you, Gail. Can you all hear me? I have a little bit of a cold, so my voice is not great. I unfortunately did not know Professor Bloodstein, but I think I can feel simply by the energy in the room when you return this afternoon and by the turnout itself, as well as some of the stories I have been hearing, that he was a remarkable man, and I wish that I had known him. For the family members who have come a long way to be with us, we certainly welcome you to Brooklyn College. We're delighted that you're here. And I'm so pleased that we have so many distinguished alumni here as well. The list is rather long, actually, of individuals they told me were coming, and I have met some of you already. We know how proud you are of this department as well as your alma mater, and we are very proud of Brooklyn College of the Speech Communications Department. They continue to do extraordinary things with some humility, but they also love to cheer when something great happens, and I can assure you that we all cheer with them. So we will make sure that the legacy that Oliver helped establish, really, here, will continue, and that you will be as interconnected as you can be in as many ways as we can make possible, because we want you to know about what's going on and to appreciate all the dedication and hard work of the current faculty and the students who are also marvelous. So thank you all for coming back, those of you who have been here before. And I hope that you have some time to visit our campus. It is a glorious day, and Fridays are, like on many state campuses, rather quiet. So if you have a chance to see some of the rest of the campus later this afternoon, I hope you will enjoy that. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. My name is Chuck Goldman. Between the time of Oliver's passing in July and the organization of this memorial to his life and work, I was struggling with an appropriate way to express my heartfelt gratitude for his ongoing influence in my life. When Professor Gerlin asked if I would serve as the Master of Ceremonies today, I responded enthusiastically and without any hesitation at all. My major regret is that when I had the opportunity, I never expressed to Oliver Bloodstein how honored I felt being a student of his, a protege of his, and later a colleague of his. I know, as all of you know, that his presence at Brooklyn College elevated our prestige as a university and legitimatized our school's long-term top rating in this field. As a student, I noticed early on how the door to his office was always open. And I can see him in there preparing notes for an upcoming lecture. And I wondered, here's someone who's probably given this lecture hundreds of times, and he's preparing it with such fervor as if he's never done this before. I had some questions to ask him often, but I left him to his notes. I didn't want to interrupt. As a mentor and a colleague, it was difficult for me to approach him often, even then. I knew I needed his counsel in teaching the treatment of stuttering class that he had developed over so many years. At the same time, I had doubts that I was up to the challenge, but I was greeted with a confidence-boosting set of his teaching notes, reference sources, and syllabus. When I was to apply to become part of the first cadre of fluency specialists in the United States, he wholeheartedly endorsed me, providing reference letters in absolute record time. I couldn't figure out why I had anxiety going past his office all these years. He was certainly not very intimidating looking, but I think I figured it out. Professor Bloodstein was so generous with his time and with his wisdom, and this somehow seemed in contrast to me with the modesty and absence of ego that permeated all of his sage advice. In some way, it seemed to me that he was embarrassed by having become one of the greatest scholars in the field of speech pathology. And I always felt this discomfort on his part. It somehow transferred to me, and I became embarrassed about speaking to one of the most approachable people that I know. It was this kind of humility that is rarely seen, and although it did provoke some anxiety between us over the years, it made me realize just how special a person I was associated with. Oliver Bloodstein taught me the most, I think, about the complexity of human behavior. In 1999, as recorded in various letters to the Journal of Speech and Hearing Research, he was embroiled in somewhat of a professional controversy with several of his research peers. Some of these professionals charged Professor Bloodstein with engaging in, quote, pseudo-science, especially when he attempted to explain his reasoning for the anticipatory struggle hypothesis and the consequent use of the term baseless cognition to refer to why people who stutter may anticipate difficulty. Professor Bloodstein's response to these charges was cited in a follow-up letter to the editor of this journal. And a quote that he ended this letter resonates with me today. And the quote is, "Even if neuroscientists someday decode the entire wiring diagram of the brain, human behavior makes the most sense when it is explained in terms of beliefs and desires and not in terms of volts and grams." Thank you. I'd like to introduce Diana Davidow, whose generosity over the years, and in 2007 especially, led to an endowment to us. Diana is an alumnus of Brooklyn College. I'd like to introduce her, please.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everybody. When I had heard that Dr. Bloodstein had died, I had such a strong sense of shock and sadness. And I really had to look at that, because who was he to me? It was like 44 years in between the last time that I really was in his presence as a professor. And I'm still so connected to this man. What's that about? So I said to Professor Gerland that I would like to just say a few words in his honor, in his memory. I had so many meaningful experiences with him. I could go on and on. For me, he was an outstanding professor of stuttering. I had the undergraduate in the mid-60s and graduate school in the early 70s with him. But what I really began to focus on was his superb and subtle ability as a mentor. A mentor is a one person working with another person to bring about a psychic change, and really that's what he did for me. He did bring about a psychic change. He engendered a sense of trust and love, and that's what I really got from this man. I got to watch a man who many people, and did see him as short in stature. I always saw him as 6'2" with a giant heart. And I remember sitting in my stuttering final in undergraduate school, and all these red spots were coming out on me, and my body in droves, and I rushed to finish the final, and I went up to, turned it in, and I said, "Dr. Bloodstein, did you ever have the chicken pox?" I said, "I think I'm coming down with it as we speak." And so, did he yell? No. Did he say, "Get out of here, I don't want to catch it"? No. He was kind and loving, and he said, "I think you better go home." My timeless connection with the Brooklyn College, timeless is right, with connection with the Brooklyn College speech department has among its origins my deeply felt respect for this man. I just wanted to say out loud that Dr. Bloodstein was a wonderful man, and that I will never ever forget him. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Jerry Siegel, an alumnus from 1953 and 1954. And please, love to hear what you have to say.
First of all, I just want to say what a thrill it is to be back on this campus and see this beautiful, beautiful place. I passed by the lily pond on the way here, and very hard for me to leave and show up at this building, but here I am. So here's a paradox. I want to talk about Oliver Bloodstein, but I can't do it without talking about myself. As I look back, I'm awed at how Oliver influenced my life. He exposed me to a profession devoted to the understanding of how we communicate with each other, and to the devastation that can occur when that basic ability is impaired. I learned for him how a teacher's enthusiasm for the process of discovery can be transmitted, passed on to students. He introduced me to the excitement of adding something to the world of knowledge and sharing it with a professional community. And he did this in the most simple, the most direct way, by living that life and by intimating that I would be worthy and welcome in his world. I first met Professor Bloodstein in the fall of my freshman year at Brooklyn College in 1949. I was 17 years old, and he was a giant of a man, at least 5 feet tall. And he grew and grew and grew over the years, of the next 5 years, as I earned my bachelor's and my master's degrees with him. I had come to Brooklyn College clutching my public speaking medal from New Utrecht High School. And though I waved that magic talisman, it didn't protect me from a particular indignity that was visited upon entering freshman in those years. I wrote about this experience in the Quarterly Journal of Speech. I wrote, in New York City, prospective teachers were required to pass a speech pedagogy examination. To pass the examination, at least for students who had been born and lived in these environs, a fundamental rule had to be applied. Don't speak like your parents. Don't talk like your friends. Be sure not to speak like your neighbors. Students failed the test, not because they were poor communicators, but because their speech reflected the linguistic habits of their community. In plain language, I flunked because I had a Brooklyn accent. And I spoke a dialect of Hebrew that you already know is called Hebronics. As Jimmy Durante was fond of saying, I was mortified. And as a matter of fact, Jimmy Durante also failed the speech pedagogy. That wound to my pride turned out to be a turning point in my personal and professional life. I, the anointed champ, public speaking champ of New Utrecht High School, was assigned to a speech class for the rabble who dentalized their T's and D's and emitted glottal stops like uncontrollable hiccups. I was mortified. But destiny is a trickster, and my mortification vanished when I met the teacher in that class, a diminutive giant with flaming red hair. Call me Oliver, he said the very first day of class, and I did, 30 years later. Professor Bloodstein was an inspiration. He cared about people, he loved scholarship, he wrote and other people read what he had written, he spoke and we pondered what he said, he paused dramatically and we held our breath until he spoke again. I was captivated from the first. I'd never heard of speech pathology, but if it was what Bloodstein did, I wanted to do it too. So I completed a BA and then with Bloodstein as my advisor, an MA at Brooklyn College. I worked on my thesis under his direction and I wrote it without a hint of a Brooklyn accent. We should use a type 6 linguist extended analysis of variance, he said, to analyze the data. And I nodded my head agreeably, though the only word in that sentence I recognized was of. Oliver had gotten his advanced degree at the University of Iowa, so that's where I went for my PhD. And if Wendell Johnson hadn't been recovering from a heart attack, I would surely have done my dissertation with him in stuttering. As it turned out, instead, I worked with Fred Darley. I was his very first doctoral student, did my dissertation in the area of aphasia. Well, while I was at the University of Iowa, I took statistics from that same linguist who had developed a type 6 extended analysis of variance that Oliver had introduced me to, and seeing the formulas again was like meeting up with someone at your high school reunion that you were never very fond of in the first place. But still, it's nice to be together again. In 1961, I joined the faculty at the University of Minnesota, and eventually, perhaps inevitably, given my early imprinting, Dick Martin and I initiated a program of research in fluency and stuttering. And as our research began to appear with some regularity in the journals, I was thrilled to see it included in Bloodstein's Handbook in Stuttering, a book I had studied so diligently over the years. And I began to correspond with Oliver, asking questions, sometimes challenging his ideas, and he did the same with the work that I was doing. I have many of those letters still, and they're models of patience and respect. In 1988, Oliver and I had a critical exchange of letters to the editor in the pages of the Journal of Speech and Hearing Disorders, where I disagreed with something that he had written. I wrote to Oliver afterward, telling him I felt honored to have had an intellectual exchange with him in the journal. And Oliver wrote back. He said, "Dear Jerry, a colleague of mine told me that when he read that's Oliver's letter, to the editor, he was totally convinced. But when he read your reply, he wavered." Oliver said, "I told him to read the reply first and the letter afterward." He then went on to present a thoughtful analysis of our disagreement, ending with, "Let me know how befuddled I am. Be well, sincerely, Oliver." What a wonderful invitation. What a wonderful gift from a former teacher. My ideas were worth arguing about. Several years after this exchange, I had the opportunity to read some personal reflections that Oliver had written actually for his family. And in it he described a painful episode when he had published a paper that deviated slightly from the ideas of his former teacher and mentor that had led to a breach between them. He wrote in that essentially biography, "The experience had one benefit for me. Years later, when former students took issue with me and their publications, I went out of my way to make it plain to them that I still considered them my friends." And of course, now I wonder whether I wasn't one of those guys, one of those students. And I hope that somehow I learned to bring that same generosity and respectful attitude to the relations I had with my own students. In 1997, I retired from the University of Minnesota after 40 years of teaching and research, and I turned to other pursuits. Oliver wrote, "I'm sorry to learn that you've abandoned speech pathology. It's a bit heart-wrenching, a little like finding out that your two best friends are getting divorced." And he said, "I'm not ready to quit. I keep teaching part-time and writing letters to the editors of the journals. What I'd like to do before I die is convince the field that incipient stutterers are having trouble executing phrase structures. Nobody seems to be impressed by my efforts, though to me the evidence is so compelling. Our warm wishes and best regards to you and Eileen. Sincerely, Oliver." Well, we continue to communicate, now mostly by email, and so, unfortunately, I don't have copies of those letters, but I treasure the ones I do have. I was writing short stories and essays, and I share them with Oliver and Annette, and look forward to their reactions, and sometimes each wrote back separately. I taught myself Yiddish, and I discovered that Oliver also had a love for the language and its literature, and I enjoyed that bond as well. I was not about to let our relationship expire. I was not about to let our friendship expire just because I was no longer working in the profession. Well, I've been retired now for 13 years, and I do not know whether anyone in the field has embraced Oliver's ideas about incipient stutterers and phrase structures. But I do know that Oliver left an indelible impression on the field, and more importantly, I think, on countless students who continue to pass on his love of inquiry from generation to generation. Some, like me, were lucky to have experienced him in person. Many more were influenced by his meticulous scholarship, his careful and creative writing, and his devotion to the field. And through his writings, he continues to teach and will for generations to come. During my undergraduate years at Brooklyn College, I acted in a varsity production of Julius Caesar, directed by Skipper Joe Davidson. I courted my wife with speeches from that play, and some of the lines are still embedded in my memory. In the very last scene, Mark Antony says of Brutus, "His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to the world, 'This was a mensch.'" I've taken some slight liberty with that quote, but I'm sure that Shakespeare would have approved, especially when applied to Oliver Bloodstein. On the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the clinical program in speech at Brooklyn College, Oliver wrote a document and cited numerous examples of the changes he had observed. Many examples of changes over those 50 years, changes in students, changes in colleagues, institutions, and in himself. And he wrote, "But these are just memorable examples of an experience that repeats itself so often that we finally come to understand, in spite of ourselves, that everywhere, always, and everyone who seems so deceptively the same from day to day, there's an onrushing process of change, growth, maturation, and fulfillment of potentialities. And from that moment on, we never look at our students, clients, or colleagues with the same eyes again." It was perhaps that understanding, that insight, that feeling that afforded me the great privilege to be Oliver Bloodstein's student, later his colleague, and I hope I have the right to make this claim, ultimately his friend.
He was a mensch. We're now going to hear from another alumnus. Andrea Blau got her master's degree in 1971, and she went on for a doctorate and a law degree. Andrea?
Well, you know I can't follow that act. So, I also didn't write anything because I'm more comfortable being a extemporaneous speaker, although I am feeling a little bit nervous. It's just, first of all, I agree it's incredibly wonderful being back here. I haven't been here since I was around 22 years old, just the other day. And I was thinking last time I was here was probably on my bicycle, you know. But it's wonderful being here. It's sad because it's about Oliver's passing, yet it's celebratory at the same time because it's about Oliver and his specialness. So I was thinking about what I would say, you know, and I couldn't mirror everything that's been spoken so far because I'm sure many of you feel that the people who've spoken so far have put so well what we've all felt for so many years. But I do reflect a certain era. And I see some of my colleagues and friends from that era. We were the late 60s, early 70s, undergrad grads, and that was a very exciting time. We closed the schools, Mark Rudd, you know, Biafra, Vietnam. It was a very exciting time. But when I think back at my time with Oliver, he was my mentor. I was not good as an interventionist with stuttering, but he was my mentor, and why I picked Oliver is obvious. He's just such an incredible human being. He was just so clear. He was sensitive, kind, brilliant, and I just gravitated towards him. And so I did my honors project as an undergrad, the metronome effect and stuttering, which he probably wrote most of it for me. Ended up going a slightly different direction, but even then. I've spent most of my career customizing intervention programs for neurologically impaired. Well, started at kids, then they became youth, then they became adults, because after 40 years, you end up, and then you end up with taking care of elderly parents, so I got into elder care too. But I remember when I started even in this field, which is partly the fault of Professor Gerland there as well, but I remember sitting in the living room with Oliver and Annette, scared to death, oh, I don't know if I can do this, I don't know if I'm smart enough or I have the ability, and they're just there to support, because for me, even though Oliver meant so much to me, as he does to each one of you, but it was Annette too, They opened up their home to us. They lived in Flatbush, right around the corner from Flatbush Yeshiva, and Danny, where are you? well, he was like my little brother to me, only 2 years younger, but at the time, 2 years is a big difference, when you're 19 and he's 17. And Judy was already out of the house, but she was a dancer, and I always loved ballet, and I would hear about Judy, and, Oliver and Annette actually opened up their home to all of us. There was a whole crew of us who camped out there. And that was the time. It was this little community, and it was just total love and support. Yeah, we were all academics, and we were all, driven by our profession, but we were a family, and we were supported through everything. And, my memories in that living room, my memories in the study with the butterflies on the wall, the butterfly collection, and his little office, because it was a little office, in the speech center. To the left of, now, Professor Boyd Sheets, had the big office, because he was still there when I was there, and I didn't really know him, and he soon, was on his way out to move to other things, but I was intimidated by him. He was a force to be dealt with, and Oliver's little office was right next to the left there, and I spent lots of time there discussing the metronome effect. Back and forth, but I graduated a little bit early, in 3.5 years, and my friends who I was like emulating, Gail and Arthur and Alita and Debbie and others, they were the year before me, but I kind of catching up because I was only half a year behind them. And it was time for my interview to work in the clinic at the fellowship, and it was half a year, so I was like, there weren't many of us doing it at that time. And I had to be interviewed by Boyd Sheets, who I really had nothing with, no interaction with, and very intimidated by. And forgive me if this is telling tales out of school, but what the hell, I'm out of school. I'm 61, I'm out of school. Finally, I only got my law degree 5 years ago, but I am out of school. I was going to be interviewed, and I was wearing this pantsuit. And so there was this tunic that came down to my knees, and then pants. Now we're talking about 1970. So, those of us in my era were like on the tail of the women's movement, and wearing pants was a big deal. Those of us here who were older than me didn't have that option, certainly not in the speech clinic. And those after me, the generations, probably don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Not pants, women, no pants. Well, no. And I was told by, I don't know which one of you guys told me right before I was going for my interview, is that you better not be wearing pants for this interview, with Professor Sheets, Now, I don't know if you were pulling my leg or not, or warning me, and I didn't live 15 minutes away from campus, so I lived in Borough Park, and I biked to school, and so I couldn't go home and change. And so we came up with a plan what I should do. Now the tunics were really down to here. They weren't. We're not talking about like a Sharon Stone, Britney Spears thing. If you take off your pants, but it was a long tunic. So the decision was I should take off the pants and just go in with the tunic, which was like a dress. And I was like mortified because it went against my principles, blah blah blah. But I really wanted to work in the clinic. I'd already found my niche, which was working with the non-speaking autistic kids and the kids with cerebral palsy. I'd already found that, because what other university as an undergrad gave you clinical responsibilities? we had that gift, and I knew what I was meant to do. And I was passionate about it, even though I was still doing the metronome effect to be with Oliver. I knew I was going a different direction. And so the pants came off, and I went in for the interview, and I remember it to this day, and I probably haven't spoken about it since I spoke to Oliver about it right afterwards, because that's what this will end up with. And I went in, and my voice kept rising because I was so angry, and I wanted to cry because this was so embarrassing for me, to do this. And he had no clue, Professor Sheets, and the interview went well, and I remember just, walking out, and the blood was rising, and the red in the face, and I stepped outside because I was very sensitive. And I remember walking out of the office, not seeing anyone, going to the right, knocking on Alva's door, bursting inside, hysterical crying, just hysterical crying. And Oliver being like all heart and sympathy, just told him what happened, and he listens to the whole story. burst out hysterical laughing. It was like the funniest thing he had ever heard. And within 2 seconds, I was laughing about how ridiculous this whole thing was. And, years later, Oliver told me that was the moment, that our bond was sealed. And so it's a story that's what I value, that part above all else. But Oliver was there for all of us. I call him Oliver, but it's 40 years now, so I have that luxury. But he was always Oliver, and Oliver and Annette, and Judy, and Danny. I felt you were I was part of your family. That was it, and I was honored by it. And even though, my life took me other directions. I've been working with neurologically impaired kids adults for all these years, and then went to law school so I could help change federal policy and disability law, and let's see where it takes me. But my heart, has been so deeply impacted by the Bloodsteins that's never far from me. And having this opportunity to come today, and Professor Gerland will tell you, getting me to actually show up, let alone speak, at something like this, I didn't hesitate. I wanted to be part of it. It's an honor. It's for me an honor to be up here to say thank you, Oliver, for opening your heart to me, to all of us, and to enriching our lives in ways that will be enriching generations to come that we can't even express. Thanks.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nan Bernstein-Ratner, who I feel has become one of the leading, most prolific researchers in the field. And the handbook on stuttering that Oliver created is like a legacy, and it's been called the single most important book in speech pathology. And Nan Bernstein-Ratner has continued that, dovetailing with Oliver's career and his life's work. And last year it was published, 2009. And we'd love to hear from her. Straight from the University of Maryland and the Okay. Correct.
Well, I'm always afraid of following or being on a podium with Jerry Siegel, and now I especially know why. He walked off with my comments. Thank you. I feel a little bit like an interloper here because I really got to know Oliver relatively later than almost everybody else here, maybe around the same time as his grandson. And I certainly didn't get to know him personally until very recently. As was mentioned, I helped him with his last publication, which was the most recent edition of the Handbook on Stuttering. And it's really a pleasure to come here and talk to you all. I get a little bit kind of emotional at events like this. That's one of the reasons why I do prepare comments. I sort of didn't meet Oliver for a very long time, but I was influenced by Oliver very, very early in my education. And as a way of thinking about it, and I've thought about this a couple of times, in particular when I was asked if I would help with the handbook, my son and I share a real fascination with a series of books. It's a short series of books called What If? I don't know if anybody's read them, but they're kind of nice. They're little chapters, and the premise of each chapter, and it's taken up by scientists or historians or just different people from different walks of life, is what would have happened in the history of mankind if very little things had been different. So, as an example, for instance, amongst the ones I remember best from the series are, what if the weather had been different on D-Day? Okay. What if Alexander the Great hadn't died so young, hadn't been bit by whatever that microbe was? And I think most of us realize that there have been points in our lives where that kind of what-if thing has happened to us. And we all sort of embrace the notion, and we love to see movies about, what if for just a little bit of difference in the way a day goes, what kind of critical fork has brought us to this point in life. But I think it's very rare that we can sit there and analyze each one of these potential forks or pinpoint them. And I can do one, and it is knowing Oliver. I met Oliver in 1975, but not personally. I was reading those works about how stuttering is all about grammatical sentence building, and in fact, I was completely starstruck and captured. And years later, I found out there was a quiet sort of irony in this. At least one person in the audience was surprised to know that I actually was in stuttering because they think I'm in language. I actually have I tell people in language that I'm a person. I do some work in language, and I know a lot about stuttering. And I tell people in fluency that I know a lot about language and a little bit about stuttering. But basically, I was sitting in a class at Temple University where I did my master's, and it turned out, but I didn't know this, that I was being taught by one of Oliver's students. And he's not here, and so I'm going to say he was miserable. And he was not really interested in stuttering. He turned out to have a lifelong interest in voice. And I was so totally bored, and I kept thumbing through my stuff and thumbing through my readings. And I was really taken by Oliver's account, which was that stuttering was really a language problem. For me, this was a godsend, particularly because all of the research in the 70s in particular seemed to focus on the larynx, which I found very boring, and which this teacher found very fascinating. And as people have commented, this notion that Oliver always had these bigger pictures. He really didn't think of stuttering as maybe living in the larynx or at your lips. It was in your brain and in your mind. And so it was basically fantastic research for me, and it spurred me to write a master's thesis that actually followed up on one of his articles, and it really changed my entire career, so that I picked up and did work in stuttering now for the rest of my life. I think it's sort of interesting because people have been commenting about the letters that Oliver's written. And I did actually disagree with Oliver to a little extent in the article that I published from that research. And he wrote me a lovely letter. And he was very kind. And he sort of thanked me for sort of making him think about the problem in a different way than he had in the article that I was responding to. It was just so typical of everything that he ever did. I didn't actually meet him until years later. I actually had to thumb back in my own sort of schedule of memories to figure out when I met him. I met him in 1995 for the first time. In the interim, he had continued to write me a lot of letters, and it's sort of the inverse of email. I have every email I've ever gotten, thanks to the University of Maryland. But I lost a lot of his letters. And the very last letter I got from him, which was actually a long time ago, because then he started emailing me, I basically was so afraid I'd lose it that I taped it to the inside of the handbook on stuttering so that I would remember where it was. And it was still there when I went looking for it. In the letter, he thanks me for something, and I can't even remember what it was. And there's no way of constructing it. But like everybody else has said, it's what he did so well. He mentored and gave positive feedback. He was just so kind to folks. And it wasn't until a year later that I actually got a chance to talk to him really in person. And it was sort of a cute story that I've told Danny, and Annette knows the story. But we had both been invited to go to Western Michigan University to give the Van Riper lectures, together with a fairly sophisticated motor speech person who at first, she knew me, we were old friends, and she's like, I don't know if I want to go there and spend a weekend with this old guy. And I said, I didn't know him that well yet, and I said, but he writes fascinating stuff. How bad could it be? And so she came, and the three of us arrived in Kalamazoo, and we were met at the airport and fed some totally unmemorable dinner. And then, in all my years of traveling and talking, I've never been put up like this. essentially what they do with guest speakers of the campus, they put them up in this, you're nodding like you know, they put them up in this mansion on the campus that somebody left them. And so instead of dropping you at the Holiday Inn, they drop you at this luxurious mansion and leave you there, and they basically sort of show you where the kitchen is, and that's it. And you sort of, it's both impressive and frightening, and actually sort of boring at some points in your life, because I was really thinking about, couldn't I use a Holiday Inn where there's a TV in your room and you can go down to the bar and have a drink with your friend and things like that. And the rooms were elegant but absolutely devoid of anything to do. And so my other friend was suffering from a cold and locked herself in the room. And I was sitting in my room with the door closed thinking, oh God, did I bring anything to read? I might have to mark papers. And there was a little knock on the door. And it was Oliver. And he said, I'm going down to that kitchen to make some tea. Do you want to come? And so I did. And the rest was a very different kind of history. That's probably what got us started on the path that eventually led to my handling the handbook, although I asked him once, what would have happened if I had said no? Who was he going to ask next? And he, true to his actual strong belief system in trying to get that theory through someday, his second choice was another person who also works in language and fluency. But I'm pleased that I didn't say no, and I actually teased the poor guy who didn't get the job at one point. He's a good friend. I said, if I had said no, you could have done this. And he was he was really. So we did eventually wind up working on the handbook together, but not that night. That night we talked a lot about science, but we actually talked a lot about a million things, because I can remember him telling me about some of his experiences during the war in the Pacific. And they absolutely stuck with me, because one image was he told a story about having to strip down out of all of his clothes and his gear and wade across a river to get to the other side. And all I could think of being basically his height at the time. Now I actually was a little bit taller the last time I saw him, but it takes a bit because I am 5 foot tall. But we were laughing so darn hard, and we laughed so hard that the other person came out of her room and joined us, and we sat up until the wee hours of the morning all talking together, and we're probably a bunch the worse for wear the next day. In being asked to do the handbook, I actually got a phone call from the publisher. Oliver didn't approach me personally, and he really didn't like to do any phone calls late in his life. I don't know if I was the only person, but he actually said to me at one point, I can't stand the publisher. She's always calling me and I can't hear her. So basically, he had the publisher call me. It's like sort of an arranged marriage. He had the publisher call me and say, Oliver would like if you would do this with him. And I, of course, said yes. It was a little bit, I've actually said to friends, it was a little bit like the scene from The Godfather in a slightly different way. I mean, what were you really going to say if you were a person in fluency being asked to take on the handbook with him? But I learned a lot about Oliver through the process, and I learned a lot of things I think, like people have said, he probably took for granted. As I went, I'm looking, it's fitting we're doing this in the library. As I did the last edition of the handbook with him, I virtually never left my desk to get into my library on my campus. Like many college libraries, they've had to put a Starbucks in it to get the students in there. Because everything's automated. Basically, I sit at my computer and I ask for an article, and then it winds up in my email. And I used computers to search. I used computers to translate articles that weren't in English. My library didn't own a book. They went and got it for me and delivered it. And as new articles would appear, I'd get these alerts. So it was a lot of work, but it was really quite doable. But Oliver did it the old-fashioned way. That's what I kept thinking every day when I went to work. Like that old commercial for that investment house. Remember John Hoffman going, he earned it, right? He would go to the library. he would scour those. There are a lot of us, at least my age, who can remember this, the books in print and articles in print, so there were no alert services. What had appeared, you'd have to scour the volumes to find out what had appeared. Then he had to find the article somehow. In those days, that usually meant writing to the author and getting it back. He collected his information on little cards and notes and things like that. And then, even trivially, because the handbook is in its 6th edition, each time he did it, he had to like cut it up and paste it and tack it together, and none of it was on computer. And so it was a huge labor of love. And I just could never figure out actually how he did it. I think of myself as a hardworking person, but I don't think I could have done it. And he strikes me as being the kind of person that there have been some recent biographies of the guys that wrote the original dictionaries and encyclopedias, and he strikes me as being exactly that kind of person. But unlike dictionaries and encyclopedias, he always ended the handbook with some sort of evaluation, some sort of an evaluative summary that he was always quick to say was his own opinion. He wasn't trying to put it off on anybody as fact. But I really relish it because so few books actually give you an opinion these days. And I actually go looking for books that place a value earned on whatever it is they're talking about. And in the last edition, it got really interesting because despite the fact that we agreed about as closely as two people in our field can agree about what stuttering is, I had a slight disagreement with him on the last chapter about whether stuttering really emerges from normal speech behaviors or whether it really at the very beginning is something very different. And I was really petrified because I couldn't see myself writing down what he had written in the last edition, but I couldn't see arguing with him. So I wrote something and I handed it off to him and asked him what he thought. And he basically said, well, I think you're wrong, but we're going to say it anyhow. And we sort of did it as a conjoined thing. This is one of our opinions, this is the other person's opinion. But he wanted the readers to decide. And as always, he was being a mentor, the kind of person who was generous and fostering and who didn't need to put other people down or prove that he was right to sort of be in the discussion. I didn't get to know Oliver as much as I wanted to. I did make stops up to Albany to visit. Mainly I was lucky in that my family's in Poughkeepsie, so I was able to combine things, and actually my son met him on a couple of trips. But along our short period of time working closely together, I learned some nice life lessons that I thought I'd share. First of all, people who know me know that I am a cockeyed optimist. I am really not a depressive personality. And Oliver, I think, was pretty much the same way, at least in the dealings I had with him, and I hear people talking about his spirit here. Even I, as a cockeyed optimist, would never have ended something as ponderous as the Handbook on Stuttering with the kind of phrases that he did, edition after edition. So he was fond of ending the whole book by saying that there was all this stuff in there and different opinions and different facts, and still nobody knew the answer to what stuttering was or how best to treat it. But that in all of this, there was certainly something that was going to help somebody. And that's really wearing your heart on your sleeve. And I really, really am glad to have been with it, to see it like that, and it's going to stay that way. The second thing he taught me is that it's okay to think out of the box. So at least one other person wound up thinking stuttering was what he thought it was. And I think the thing is that Oliver has been vindicated. So I want to just say this to people who are not in fluency, that it seemed kooky in the early 80s or late 70s to suggest that stuttering had its origins somehow in language formulation, but the more we look at the brains of people who stutter, children and adults, the more it's quite clear he was actually probably right. And in fact, the motor person who was with me at that first conference in that little mansion, she's shown, interestingly enough, that when people who stutter are put under language pressure, their motor systems decompensate in interesting ways that you don't see in other populations. And so I think that what he taught me was it's okay to be sort of ahead of your time or outside the box, go for it. Because you could be wrong, or you could be right. And that's the business that we're in. I think that's why he was so good at making a handbook. It's about thinking. All those thoughts are valuable. That's why we have to keep them in one place so we can go back and see what they look like. Because some things are old, become new again, and vice versa. And the third thing that he instilled in me is a very great personal hook. Because I used to come back from all of our meetings and every email interchange that I had with him, and he was emailing with me the week he died, trying to respond to a couple of girls in a class at Wisconsin who wanted something explained in the handbook. And it was like both of us were fed up to hear. And so we were having trouble because we'd respond to the girls and they didn't seem to understand, and we'd respond back and then they didn't seem to understand. And it's like, I don't know, are we writing your term paper for you? But the issue was that he was so quick and adept and nimble and with it right until the very end. And I kept saying to people, I wanted to be as smart and as alert and with it now as he was, close to 90. And he was so vibrant to the end. And I think I expected him to live forever because you never saw him slow down. And so in your heart he's an elderly gentleman, but he's just so there. And so it was a real shock to get Janny's email. So I'm going to miss him. But the handbook's going to live on. And it's always going to be the Bloodstein handbook. We actually promised that to the publisher. I promised it to the publisher. And I think that he'll be content with that other people will read what he's put together, read about his theories. I happen to think we'll be back here someday saying he was right. I really believe he was right. But I think that he left so much to scholars and thinkers is his best memorial. Other than the people in this room, when I wrote this, I didn't think to hear all the other people talk and to know that he's touched so many other lives. But I think he'd be content with all of us. I really do.
Appreciated those insights personally. It was very, very heartwarming. I'm assuming that there are people in the audience that also have some insights and some things that they would perhaps like to share. We do have enough time. If anybody would like to come up, just do so. Speak a few words. We'd all love to hear something that you have. I do. Yeah, please. This side down.
My name is Elisa Seidel. I'm one of the sheep who strayed from the flock. I am not in speech pathology, although my career has kind of paralleled speech pathology. So, with that said, I'm not going to talk academics. I'm going to talk about the man and the love that emanated from him and was given back to him. And I can only say to you that when I heard of his passing, I felt so compelled to just write everything that was in my mind in a letter to Annette. So I'll give you a little bit because I know a lot of you haven't had lunch and I don't want to take up too much time. Nobody mentioned the hikes. The hikes on the Appalachian Trail. We laughed so hard on these hikes. And I think what happened in that group, that late 60s, early 70s group, was that we took a very humble man and we made him hysterical. He laughed so hard that there were times that we couldn't move. And those were the kinds of experiences we had with him. I personally will tell you that during the summer that I was writing my thesis, and I have something to say about that too, was the same summer that Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky played their championship. So I would go over with a chapter, and then we would play an afternoon of chess. I was a really good chess player. When I played with Oliver, I felt like a moron. He was so good, but he was so patient. And in all of those days, I won one game. And when I won that game, I think he was happier than I was. It was a delight being with him. When you sat and you spoke with Oliver, you were the only person on the planet. There was nothing, there were no interruptions. He didn't jump in to a sentence. He listened, and he took it in, and he gave loving, important information. And I'm not only talking about academics, I'm talking about life and how important he was in our lives. He was humble, he was generous, and his generosity, I think if you take a look at some of the articles that he wrote that included some of his students, you never saw the first name on that article, Bloodstein. You always saw the first listed name on the article was the student whose material was in that article. Now, clearly, I'm sure that any time an article was written and sent to Asher that had Bloodstein on it, it was going to be published. But Seidel, I don't know. I mean, I like myself, but I don't think I'm that important. Anyway, to cut this very short, I mean, I can go on forever. I can go on to the surprise party in the house, the Sunday night that I left Brooklyn College, and another one of our colleagues called me to say, Oliver needs to speak with you. And I said, oh my God, what did I do? And I got there, and it was this fabulous party. And Andrea's right. It was like a family. It was a place to go. It was the kind of thing that you used to read about when people in far-off universities would go to their professor's house and they would have, like, an evening. You didn't have that in a metropolitan college. We had it. So, to finish up, I will tell you just one quick thing. I was at a memorial service for a colleague, and I was sitting next to a rather self-important colleague. And everyone was coming and just lauding this person. And this colleague turned to me and said to me, what do you want them to say about you? And I said that if anybody ever speaks about me at my demise, I would like them to say that they're a better person for having known me. Well, I will tell you, I'm a better person for having known Oliver Bloodstein.
I was a newcomer during the time of those hikes. I always wanted to go on those hikes. Anyone else would like to speak? Please.
60 seconds. Maybe 90. 85 minutes. I'll be fast. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gail Olenek. I am an alumni of Brooklyn College. I am from the era of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. To this day, I cannot call Dr. Bloodstein Oliver. That's just something that I can't do. He will always be Dr. Bloodstein. That's how I met him. That's how I will always remember him. I wanted to share two things, and the first one is that when I took the class, I believe it was The Nature of Stuttering, Dr. Bloodstein walked into the class. He introduced himself, told us what the class was going to be about, 20, 30 some odd students. Class passed. 2 days later, we had the class again, and Dr. Bloodstein walked in. He knew every single one of us. Every single one of us by first name and by last name.
And all of us would sit in the class and say, how the hell did he do that? How does he know us? How did he do it? It was just something about him. A couple of years passed, and it was time for me to take what was then called the National Teacher's Exam. In those days, I was very cocky, thought I knew it all, thought I was the best. I was proven wrong, not once, not twice, not 3, not 4, 5 times. I took that National Teacher's Exam 5 times. And by the 5th time, when I had failed again, I had walked into the college, into Boylan Hall, and there was Dr. Bloodstein, and he saw that I was clearly upset. And he came over to me and he said, Gail, dear, what's the matter? In that soft tone. Nothing, Dr. Bloodstein, I'm fine. Gail, dear, come into my office. And at that time, he was I believe he was the chairperson, the director. And he had that big office right in the front. And he walked me in, and he sat me down, and he said, Gail, dear, what's the problem? And I told him. And he said, dear, I'd like you to do me a favor. I said, okay. He said, I'd like you to come to me every day after your class. I want you to come here during club hours, and we'll talk. And I said, well, that's great, Dr. Bloodstein, but what are we going to talk about? And he said, Gail, dear, I'm going to help you pass that exam. I said, okay. So I went. Day after day, day after day. It lasted about 6 weeks. And I took the NTEs again. I am very proud to say that I got a perfect score. And when I did get my exam grade back, of course I went to Dr. Bloodstein and I said, I got my exam back. And he said, Gail, dear, how did you do? And I said, I passed. I did beautifully. He said to me, I told you you could do it. I will never, ever, I have the chills, I will never, ever forget that, how this professor took his time to tutor me. He knew how distraught I was. He knew how cocky I was. But he took the time to sit with me and to tutor me. And his kind words, his gentle words, I never did any of that hiking stuff, and I never went to his home. However, he had such a strong impact on me, and I will never forget that. And I remember what he did for me, and now as I teach, I remember what he did for me, and part of him lives in me for my students when I teach. And I remember what he taught me, and that was to be kind, and that was to be loving, and certainly not to be cocky anymore.
I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's been incredible, and I want to express particular appreciation to all of you who shared your thoughts and your experiences with us. We have a book outside. If you haven't previously signed it, please do so. If you'd like to just email us your reflections, we do want to compile the reflections of the people who participated here today, as well as others who might not have been able to join us. We have now established the Oliver Bloodstein Memorial Graduate Scholarship at Brooklyn College. Many of you have already supported that scholarship, and I'm very grateful to you for that. If you need any additional information about that, we have some little handouts that could just give you some information if you just need to either know how to make that contribution or perhaps to share that with others who are not here today. But before we close, I think it's only fitting that we conclude today by giving the last word to Oliver himself. In 1997, Oliver wrote a memoir of sorts for his grandsons, and he entitled it Grandpa's Life. And I would like to read the final paragraphs of that memoir to you as we conclude today. In 1996, at the age of 75, I formally retired after 48 years as a Brooklyn College teacher and 10 years as the director of its program in speech pathology and audiology. But I'm still teaching the courses I enjoy as an adjunct professor and will continue to do so as long as I'm able to. The most important thing I've learned from living is that life is unpredictable. The Great Depression was bad, but it saved me from becoming a high school teacher. World War II was bad, but the GI Bill gave me the vocation I was best fitted for. The atomic bomb was bad, but it may well have saved my life. Even failing to make junior high was a great good fortune, because otherwise who knows what kind of a woman I would have been married to. And you, my grandchildren, would not have been you, but somebody else. I don't believe that my life has any more purpose than that of any other living thing that is born, grows to maturity, and dies. But my life has had a lot of meaning of a sort and deep satisfactions. I've had a wellspring of devotion from the person who mattered most to me. I've had a professional career of some value to others. I've achieved everything in my work that I could have hoped to, and I'm gaped at conventions, the way Johnson and Van Riper used to be. I've had the pleasure of creation that comes from writing. I've had the joy of teaching and the appreciation and affection of more students than I can remember. I have children, children-in-law, and grandchildren that I'm proud of. And they've taught my grandchildren to play chess. Oliver Bloodstein, February 1997. Folks, please join us over in the Speech and Hearing Center. We're going to have some refreshments up there. Thank you very much.